We are live. Welcome, everybody, to the Home Front Live. It is 10 o'clock in the East and 7 o'clock in the West. I am your host for this morning. My name is Reed Galen, and I could not be more excited and delighted to be joined by historian extraordinaire Alexis Coe. Alexis, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back.
All right, so guys, Alexis is an incredible writer. If you have not read her book about George Washington called You Never Forget Your First, please do so. It is fun, it is informative, and I promise you it is the most readable history of George Washington you are going to find out there. But Alexis, you also have a book coming out next year about a young John F. Kennedy. So tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll get into why you had such I'll call it an incredible experience a few weeks ago.
My book on young JFK is from 1917 to 1957. And I feel like there has been this assumption that has calcified over time, particularly in view of Trump, where people assume that Kennedy was just a pretty rich boy who ascended to the presidency because his dad kind of paid for it. And then that was the end of it. And the thing is, all presidents are said to have an evolution. I rarely find that happens. In particular with Washington, I really don't think that he did. I think he got better at understanding how people saw him,
Right.
but didn't actually evolve as a person, which is a really interesting struggle to watch over time. And Kennedy did. He spent 11 years in Congress. And so I'm really focusing on that. And then in the process, as a historian, you hope to find one new thing, two new things. I have found 3 categories of new things. So it's just beyond thrilling. I'm so excited.
Well, good. Yeah. And because I think for most of us who weren't around, frankly, when President Kennedy took office, we don't really think about him before, that those first images of him standing on the west front of the Capitol,
Absolutely.
sort of extolling a new generation at the time. His generation, I think we would call them they would have been the greatest generation, right? That's what we would have called them now. And then, of course, our parents. I think each one of our parents has that remembrance of November 1903, where they were, what they were doing, et cetera, et cetera. All right, but about President Kennedy. So you were invited by a congressional committee to come and testify about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. So give us a sense of how this invitation came to be and then what that experience was like.
It's, I wouldn't have said that it was on my bucket list, but, I am obviously someone who sees a lot of congressional testimony in history and know that historians get called once in a while. And so I was really excited. It's not my favorite subject matter. It was on the JFK declassification files that were released. And I sort of thought, okay, I talked about that when it first happened. Nothing has changed my posture. Nothing has come out that's different. So I'm going to go. I didn't know that I was, it's an honor to be accepted. You get this great fake summons. It's it's on professional paper, and it's, the Congressional Oversight Committee, the House of Representatives, requests that you come testify as a witness. And you think okay, I'm definitely going to frame that.
Right.
And had it not been one of the most depressing episodes of my life, I think I would have. I called you on the way home. I was
I know.
this is awful. It was, so I went, and I did know, there's some things from afar that Congress is at a really critical state of dysfunction and ineptitude. And already that you're the minority. I was called by the minority party. So I'm the minority witness, meaning that the majority, the Republicans, are really running the show. And I knew that Representative Luna, who is the chairwoman, I thought she was interesting going, and I thought, okay, it looks like grandstanding, but... And the previous one just had Oliver Stone, who I do not care for. And I was on a podcast a while ago. Jamel Bowie has a podcast with another historian, John Gans. I was on it just reeling because it's the most ridiculous. Nothing makes sense about it. I understand why you would like it, but it has given legs to so many things that So I knew the odds were not ever in my favor. And
Right.
I sort of, Luna I thought was interesting because she had advocated for women to be able to vote when they were immediately postpartum. which Republicans are really against, in the House, in the Senate, because why would you want another vote?
Well, let's be clear, Alexis. They don't not only want you to vote in Congress, they're not really fans of you voting at all
They're not
in
really
any
fans of you
capacity.
voting. They like the pregnant part, unfortunately, once you have the baby, that complicates their version, but
Right.
they're like, "Sure." So I thought, "Maybe she's interesting." I went in kind of like, "Okay." I labored over my statement. You get to make a statement, and I was told I got 4 or 5 days in advance notice, and I was told it was 5 minutes, and then, like, the morning of, I was told it was 10 by the Conservative Party. And they did a lot of sort of tomfoolery. They didn't upload my statement. They didn't list me as a witness. They had everyone up for like 48 hours before that. And when I saw who was there, I was like, these are some, I wasn't familiar with them and not, I don't, in no other setting would we have all been together, I think.
Right. Right.
When I looked them up, it was like, oh, these are real grassy knoll people.
So let's take a
Yeah.
break. So all right. So first of all, so the chairwoman of the committee or the subcommittee is Anna Paulina Luna from
Yes.
I think she's from like Western Florida. She's sort of kooky. She's another one of these MAGA Republican members who sort of made up their biography out of whole cloth.
Her
If
wiki
you
is
go
amazing. Everyone should go to it.
Right, yeah, but then, you talk about 5 minutes versus 10 minutes. Well, first of all, I if anybody's ever had the opportunity or the requirement to speak for 5 minutes, written statement, oral statement, like, that's longer than it seems, but also for someone like you, Alexis, like, look, I could write a 10-minute statement in about 10 minutes because it's just blah, 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 but you're thoughtful, right? That's the advantage you have. Disadvantage, maybe. Like, I can just blurt it out. You have a thoughtful nature too, because of course you're a historian, so you want to provide the context, the background. But also, as I read your statement, you were polite, you were diplomatic, but you didn't pull any punches in what you thought about this whole sort of farce either.
Yes, I did. I went in, if I went in with an agenda, it was to win, not hearts and minds, but a heart, a mind sort of thing. And to really remind them that these are real people, that there are limitations in our ability to access information, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not. It's not the fault of the librarians are not in cahoots with the CIA. Quite the opposite, I think. And I wanted to win them over. So I crafted like a far too beautiful statement for it was like showing up to a barbecue in a ball gown, you know? It was like I definitely I was like, historians are like time travelers, and I was just here because I was just with Kennedy in the House of Representatives. So I tried to, like, juxtapose it, inspire them, but I also did a little tisk-tisking where I said, "Nothing has come out of here that's new. The only thing I've seen is a lot of personal information I should not have because it's so sloppy and so rushed." There were, Social Security numbers of living people who are still in government,
Right.
and then I said at the end, because I had just seen Good Luck, Good Night in the city, and I thought, "Okay, I'm gonna get them." I'm gonna say, when Kennedy entered the Senate, which of course I'm sure they all aspire to do, he came in when McCarthy was, like, about to be censured, and that's because American people tire of that. And so I did sort of end it with, like, "You have a choice. You should make it. Like, this guy is not going to be holding you and, dictating everything you say forever if you want to continue in this life of, public service." So it was I definitely went hard,
Yeah.
um, and I have heard a lot of comments in my email and such about it from people.
Right. Well, I can only imagine. So let
Yeah.
me ask you this, just to take a slight step back. Why are they, from your perspective, I should say, why are they obsessed with President Kennedy's assassination? Is it this whole idea of the deep state and that there's always a conspiracy? Or is it distraction? What do you think it is?
I think it's all of the above because it is curious, right? Why do they care so much? Why wouldn't they be talking about um, you know, other conspiracies that have to do with their party that they feel like their party has been the target of? Um, I think in general, it's really safe to say that Trump is fairly obsessed with the Kennedy family and with disparaging them. And so ostensibly, I do think, and this is sort of, he's taken everything that Kennedy created, whether it's US aid or the Kennedy Center or, cultural bipartisanship. And, Kennedy himself, when he was president, it's very hard to call him too liberal. And
Right.
he, throughout his entire career, said, I'm not that liberal. And he wasn't. Story checks out. A lot of people project onto him the way they did, like, onto Obama, for example.
Right.
And so I think that it is an obsession with the Kennedy family. And then I think it's total distraction because what was interesting is at one point, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, the one question I got was about this, access, blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, this is a really interesting moment of unity because the one thing it seems like we all agree on is that the CIA during this time was absolutely terrible. So then why are you not putting in some kind of why are you just releasing the MLK archives in the same manner, like transparency, transparency? But they're not in any way offering context. So they're not contextualizing it. They're not putting anything that says like, hey, Edgar Hoover was awful
Right.
and this is going to be 2.0. So, and they immediately, Garcia, the one Democrat who showed up at this ridiculous dance, the one person who showed up was like, oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're all very concerned about that. Anyway, moving on. So they're not. They're absolutely not. And what really made me upset about this was everyone, it was like the emperor has no clothes. Everyone kept saying well, obviously based on this release, we need more. And they kept demanding more. And Luna was like, oh yeah, we're going to use every international relationship that we have that we've worked really hard for to get more. It's like, what are you doing? Eggs are $10. I couldn't even find them yesterday. This is ridiculous.
Well, so I mean, there's a couple of things there. One is, again, the whole idea of this, right? So,
Yeah.
you're coming down. I assume they're not covering your travel expenses, right? So,
No, it is my honor. It is my
right, it's your
patriotic honor.
honor. Um, then it's, you talked about Oliver Stone. So did they show JFK as like a JFK the movie as a documentary, right? Which was such a ridiculous thing, and all of this. And then you had which rep? You said Garcia, but which
Robert Garcia.
all right, so you got Robert Garcia. So it all, this is something I think you and I spoke about, which is like, you've got Luna up there being as crazy as she can be because she's trying to get her 15 minutes and they're all trying to get their 15 minutes. And then you got Garcia, who's like, should be the one, if you're in the minority party or the opposition party, maybe that's what they should be saying, like, this is crazy, right? Like, all of this
Yeah.
is crazy. Like, maybe we
Yes.
shouldn't do this anymore.
Yes, he should have, and he kept saying, "Look, I believe in access." He had some good things to say, but he didn't take that step, and that's when I realized that, they really we see this from afar, and we think, they have no backbone, they don't know what to do, they aren't coming up with phrases, they aren't, really an opposition party under these circumstances should be way ahead. They always have been. That's how the Republicans came to power. Contract with America was written, it was released 11 months after an election. That's a big deal. And they are just Garcia was still sort of like, "Oh, I'm going to talk about how this is good because color, 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 it added color." No one has yet to point out to me what color we're talking about. Because I swear to God, if you gave me a decent internet connection and an hour, I could find all that color and that it pre-existed this release.
Right.
So he was really, so magnanimous and didn't I don't understand why he was playing that game. I've liked him in other contexts. So I was sort of like, "Why are you just" and then he left. And then it was just me and them and a bunch
I
of
know.
bros a
I
bunch
know.
on the
Just
side wall that you couldn't see.
it's just you with your piece of paper defending yourself against the slings and arrows of insanity. So you mentioned the other people testifying. So give us a sense of this murderer's row of zombies.
Uh, so I want to put this is not my phrasing, but I think it was I saw it constantly on socials and it was it was like elder abuse in some cases. There was one man who was on a screen, and what we should talk about the screen because he was the small picture on the screen, and the big picture was Tucker Carlson. And it was like a group shot, and I'm pretty sure Joe Rogan was on the other side, but I wasn't wearing my glasses and my allergies were I wasn't wearing contacts. I'm vain. So I was like, I can't see what's going on, but I'm pretty sure that is also Joe Rogan on the other end. And you have,
Right.
I mean, it was bizarre, but you have this man who's like, you could not see his face. He was hunched over, he was drooling, he was falling asleep. They had to take breaks from him. He's remote. He's propped up by 2 people. And then at the other end, you have a man who was 25 and in the ER when Kennedy was brought in. So now, he's just minutia, 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 and then all of a sudden he'd be like, "And LBJ was in on it." You're like, 1, wow, 2, that's not your expertise. These people had, one was a judge at some point. They had 1 or 2 had tangential links, but otherwise I was like, "You're from YouTube. Like, what is happening here?" And no, and everything they said was entered into the record without any sort of, even if you buy 500 copies of your own book, the New York Times, it makes the New York Times bestseller list, they put a little asterisk. It's like,
Oh, really?
this wasn't
Oh, I
yeah,
didn't know that.
this wasn't right. This isn't like, this is a little sketchy. And
Yeah.
that's all I wanted. That's all I wanted. I was just like, I was the last one to go. And of course, she didn't even introduce me. She kept saying crazy iterations of my name. I've never heard Coe before. I've heard Coe. I've heard a lot of things for Coe. I've never heard Coe. And she didn't introduce me. She didn't like say my bio. And I finally, when they get to me, I almost wanna take a minute, but I know I can't, but I almost wanna be like, I just wanna say everything was wrong. Like, 99% of this was wrong. So they didn't bring their A game. They didn't bring their A game.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
and that's the other part. I mean, I think sometimes we forget, people say if you look at you mentioned incompetence at the beginning, and people are like, these people are incompetent. Like, that's the point, right?
Yeah.
Like, the incompetence is the point. Now, typically the bad guys will trade incompetence for somebody who is truly bad and good at their job, right?
Yeah.
But the incompetence is the point right now, which is they'll do whatever they're told. And I think that's the underlying piece of this too, is that it distracts. It's one more, thing of throwing dust into the air to just keep everybody like, what are we doing? What's happening? And then, of course, the downstream effect of that, Alexis, as you know, is people just start tuning out because it's just too much. And that is a natural human reaction,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Which is, I have no idea what's going on. And then you've got, again, I think that there's this long-standing process. Well, first, if you go back, I mean, you tell me. Let me ask the question as opposed to asserting it. Um, I would assume, based on your research going back to President Washington, that previously General Washington, Colonel Washington, Gentleman Farmer Washington, that the United States was birthed out of a desire to be away from an autocratic government, right, away from a monarchical government, and we never really got over that. Right? We never really got over it. We always have this sort of, well, even I think Democrats, no one would call it libertarian, but sort of a mistrust, distrust, dislike. But the Republicans for a long time, but the Trump folks in particular have gone out of their way to completely delegitimize the idea of it in its entirety, that governance in and of itself is illegitimate.
Well, I wonder why.
Right.
It's a I mean, yes, absolutely. One of our greatest, I would say, civic reflexes is paranoia, and another civic reflex is this idea of independence and that we are, persevering and trying to do something better. But there's no there now. Like, with Washington, all of these people were incredible, and I tried to really hit home about this, that there's this duality that there seems to exist within the conservative party. Like, you can't, either people are all terrible or all perfect, and that's it, nothing in between. And I've never met a person like that.
Right.
And I look at everyone, the part of being a historian that's a lot, though many parts are fun, but I'm a snoop. I am a detective. I am looking through everyone's diaries and their letters and if I look through your email, you would not be a perfect person either, but you'd have good days and you'd have bad days and all these things. They cannot wrap their heads around that. And they also, though, the problem is they don't know who they are. And and this is a crisis a crisis that has infected both parties.
Right.
They don't, they know what they're against and they're good at dismantling things, but it's much harder to build things. And
Right.
they are, this is a crazy distraction. And and really kind of very silly, and it wasn't treated seriously by these people. There was stadium seating in this grand room with 2 American flags, and at one point, it was like those American flags that was as many members who showed up. Nancy Mace breezed in and out, all these people came in and out. They just it was I think it was just so flimsy up close. It's not like it looks substantial from afar, but it was, in the words of Cher from Clueless, it was like a full-on Monet. You
Right.
got there and you're just like, "Oh my god, this is awful." And Luna just was like, all the time, and everything was like, "Oh, isn't it interesting they can't find that?" No, you just cut 10% of the library's funding, so how do you
Right.
think they're gonna do that? How do you think they're gonna find it? This is a normal part, and what was absurd to me is the other, people on the panel next to me, they had no idea how archives work. They were railing against them, and they were saying all these things, and everything was about access and hiding things, and they just had no idea how any of things. I'm not sure they've ever gone into an archive, and they're so entitled, and I think that was something that was really interesting. I would say that was the biggest difference. The Liberal members were a little bit they were very apologetic to me afterwards, and they were very, um, kind of like, "We're doing the best we can," which I don't think is true.
Right.
And then the conservatives were so, like, you felt like you might get jumped, it was so like, the atmosphere was so tense for no reason, there was no civility, no unity. You were coming and you were fighting the dumbest fight. It was like everyone showed up with the dullest, things. No one had done any research.
Right.
No one was interesting or informed.
Well, I mean, look, there's a couple things we know historically. One is that the fight has to continue, right? The revolution can never end.
Right.
That battle, there always has to be a battle, and certainly we've seen that from this administration, that there's any number of battles on any given day. And again, that goes back to this whole idea of my friend Trygve Olsen, which we'll be talking about, I think, on Thursday, which is, these folks have to live in the present, which is ironic considering that they're going back to JFK. But like again, it can't allow for anybody to get away long enough to have any sort of thoughtful, you know, let me rest and repose and consider what's happening here. But I think the other part too that you said is like they said they're doing the best they can, but they're not. And I say this not to put you in the political strategist or commentator hot seat, but over the weekend, this goes back to the separation of powers. Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries was on CNN and was being asked by Dana Bash about these the DHS officers moving into a congressional office, and he said, we will do something at the time and place of our choosing. And Bash was not rude, right? She's like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And he just like Rubio did when Chris Christie went after him in that debate years ago, he literally repeated verbatim the same thing over and over again. And to your point, like if it was Garcia on this committee or Jeffries, like Jeffries should have gone into Johnson's office and been like, slammed his hand on the door or on the desk and say, "You're not going to do this to my people anymore. I promise you, this will not work out well for you." Now they
Yeah.
would have said, "Oh, Hakeem Jeffries goes crazy." Fine, right?
Yeah.
Fine,
Which is
but
good. Why
it,
wouldn't that be a good thing? If you're gonna make viral moments, make them count.
right. But
Mhm.
again, there seems to be this, and I've said this before, and I'm sure you mentioned that Kennedy was no liberal, but Kennedy also understood the theatrical nature of politics, right? Which there very much is one, which is you have to be for something. And typically, I think you have to be for something big. And certainly Kennedy was that. And I think that, of course, so much of what he could have done and would have done was overshadowed by the fact that his presidency was cut short. But so much of what he would have done, was carried on by Johnson. We sent a man to the moon or men to the moon. Civil Rights Act, uh, Voting Rights Act, all that got done in the wake of his assassination. And so, his legacy, maybe Alexis, was something that was maybe more powerful even than his life in some ways.
Absolutely, and I think that was something I really wanted to hit home with them too, because they love attention, right? And I said that's not a bad thing. Like Kennedy loved attention too. Clearly, he knew how to work the
Sure.
moment and capitalize on it. And But the thing is, he only did that when he had something to show for it. So he would labor over the way he courted Jackie was he made her translate. She was fluent in French, and he really wanted to understand Indochina and what was going on because he didn't believe what he was hearing or seeing. And so he wanted like texts that were not given to them that weren't translated. So that's how some people send flowers, that's what he did. And
He sent her a
he
homework assignment.
he sent her so many boring, like, really, like, policy and this was she worked at a paper, but, she wasn't, she was, like, 23 and she was like, "Thank you. Um, maybe we could just go on a real date one day."
Right. How
And
about dinner? How about we do
yeah.
dinner before we do transliteration? Right.
I
Yes.
think they were, like, engaged by the time he had time for dinner. But so I said, he understood that, but he was working with something, and I think what you're saying is essential, and by the way, I think this for both parties, and this is something we always agree on, which is that both parties are doing a terrible job of upholding the obligations and the responsibilities that they have to the American people and to the Constitution and to the country, particularly as we approach our 250th. And I said, I published a bunch of articles after the debate saying, like, Biden needs to not only step aside, but he needs to resign. This has to be a moment in which the Democrats can be the party they say they are. I think the biggest crisis for the American people is that they don't really feel like either party can do what needs to be done or is willing or has the capacity. And I left certainly feeling like, oh my goodness, I hope that midterms brings in, I hope all the young people I'm seeing running on social media, all these other people, I hope they do well because these people are a lost cause. And it is incredibly disconcerting. Like you said, I think Hakeem Jeffries should have walked in there and said, this is unacceptable. And he should have been arrested because the thing is, when we all say fascism, 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 I know it's not a good in some ways, it's not a good word because people have become a nerd to it already, but
Right.
but it is unfortunately really boring in textbook, and you go through and you destroy culture, you take away people's rights, you make threat like, now, I am for sure it would be very difficult for me to come back into the country. I will be allowed back in, I was born here, I'm not a first-time, but I will be stopped for something, it held for like 20 hours for testifying before Congress. That is not supposed to happen in America. And this party that's all about small government and big rights and all of these things, they're the progenitors of this very real fear that we should all have. Because if someone can be, to sort of step back here, what we're talking about is not only who we've been and who we are, but who we will be, right? So we know right now that people can be deported even, we know that a lot of the people who are in Venezuela, they were not violent criminals. And if we can't get them back, the American government is unwilling to get them back. We are not that far off from American citizens being in the same position.
But that's I wrote something in my last post yesterday, which
Yeah.
you all can find at the home front. This is one thing that I'm concerned about to that point, and this is something Robert Kagan in a book he wrote called Rebellion is paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln at the Lyceum in 1838, which is people who have rights, right, or whose rights are established, really stop worrying about them. Not only for themselves because they're not worried anymore, but especially for other people, right? And it's not until a crisis shows up literally at their doorstep that they start to take it seriously again. And I think that's my fear, Alexis, is that not that anything that we're seeing is okay, but that we shouldn't be under any illusion that there's going to be mass uprising until and unless the average American like you or more average Americans, individual Americans who, let's call them white, let's call them upper middle class, whatever it is, start to get picked up because they're like, well, there's always the rationalization. Well, maybe they were here illegally. Well, who knows what they did? Maybe they shouldn't have said that if they'd kept their mouth shut, right? And that's all, of course, part of the process, which is now you start to say, okay, well, why do I even want to get involved in this? I don't like these people. I don't like this stuff. I don't like Trump. I don't like Harris. I don't like Biden. I don't like any of them. You know what? I just want to get on with my life. I just want to get on with
Yeah.
my life. And of course, that is what you're talking about, which is that leads to the darkness. And I don't remember, you'll probably tell me is like, you can hope that politics leaves you alone, but it never does, right?
No.
Or you can ignore politics, but politics doesn't ignore you, I think is the
Yeah.
quote. But it's hard to understand that, and it's very unsatisfying And it's very frustrating because you're like, this is not okay. Guys, this is not okay. And even some of my friends, and let me just say this too. I'm sorry to go on a rant here. Most of the guys that I know who voted for Trump, right? Like they are college graduates. A lot of them went to grad school. They have good jobs. They live in nice neighborhoods, right? They got a little bit squirrely at the beginning of April with the whole Liberation Day tariff thing because they saw
Yeah.
their 401ks taking a nosedive and the market taking a
Yeah.
nosedive. But even when I was texting with one of my friends, he said maybe we should have a conversation about how this is insane. But then Alexis, he came right back to immigration, and so he sort of started right where he ended right where he started, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Which is
Yeah, yeah, it's
he
full
knows
circle.
he's
Yeah.
going to be fine, right?
Yeah.
He knows he's going to be fine. The world works for him. And until and unless we see a complete or a collapse big enough for guys like my buddy, unfortunately, I'm afraid that it's going to be hard to get more than those folks who are very, very concerned about, the things that we're seeing already, but they were concerned before, right? To
Yeah.
get new entrants into the resistance movement is, I think, unfortunately going to take A, time, but B, also something a lot worse than we've seen. And I can't believe I have to say that out loud.
Yeah. Well, it's like it unfortunately, throughout history, there have had to be these moments where things have gotten so dire, and that's the only way that we see change.
Right.
Would Trump have won a second term, consecutive term, had COVID not happened? Probably is what we
Yes, he would
understand
have.
now. Yes. Certainly, I can tell you, I don't think Joe Biden would have won. And I look throughout history and I see that things have to get as bad as possible, and it's always this moment where they think, "It doesn't affect me, it doesn't affect me." The thing is, I understand and I was raised by conservatives. I understand all of this, and I consider myself, which is very hard for people to, America first, country first, and I'm pretty much bipartisan, and right now, I don't like any of them. I don't like either party. I don't think there's a good alternative. I have a problem with even the most progressive, the most this, the most that. But I think the issue here is when there is a lack of empathy, when there is a sliding scale for rights, you're only safe for so long. The
Right.
people you love are only safe for so long. You may think ostensibly this is not going to, I can figure out how to game this financial crisis. I can figure out how to replace the people who worked for me. I can do all of these things to make my life as comfortable as possible. And then it happens. And then something happens. And you realize, "Oh, I didn't see this coming." There's a lot we did not. Did anyone see Elon Musk coming? There's so much that people have not seen coming, and they're just not getting the memo that what you want is an agreed upon set of facts and principles and values, something we used to call the Constitution,
Right.
and then you wanna move forward, and you can debate it for the rest of time. That's what amendments are for. But there's a reason we have due process, and when I think about, anything to do with rights, it has been such an evolution. You named some of them. Was voter fraud a big deal before 1965? Absolutely. Like voter rights, access, blocking access, all of these things. It was pretty terrible on a myriad levels.
Yeah, you could make an argument that the postbellum South, right, the Jim Crow South was not those states were not small d Democratic. They were big D
No.
Democratic, but they weren't
Yeah.
small d Democratic.
Absolutely, and then you go forward and you have 1965, the Voters' Rights Act. Everything is basically fine. There are minimal cases. The reporting is so low, it's almost, like, cute that we had so many people regulating it, and then you have it gutted, and now we have problems again. And you also, though, what we're talking about here, not only with voting, and we talked about it with transparency, with all of these things, let's just make it clear that this is projection.
Oh
They're
yeah.
telling you what they're doing, and then but they're accusing you, the other party, whomever, of doing it. They're doing it. They're telling you what they're doing, and I think that's what's so scary to me because there are all these really, really intelligent people on both sides of the aisle who are they're sort of at a loss. And I think the problem is we really have a crisis of leadership here. But another thing that I think Jamel Bouri has been doing, I've been doing it, I think you've been doing it too, is you don't say they're unconstitutional. You have to say they're anti-constitutional. Because
Mhm.
this isn't about unconstitutional makes it almost seem like a really quaint debate. Like, oh, it's those
Right.
people in government. They're like fighting about whether something is in the Constitution. It's all vague interpretation, blah, blah, blah.
Sure.
We've seen courtroom dramas before. That's not
I
what
watch
this
Law and
is.
Order. Right.
Yeah, that's not what this is. This
Right.
is not procedural. This is the procedure. It doesn't matter. The Supreme Court can tell this president, you can't do that. And he'll be like, I think I can.
Right.
There's no and everyone is complicit. We've never had a trifecta presidency like this, and it is absolutely terrifying for someone like me to watch. But we were supposed to evolve, and we haven't. Like, this is definitely a part of testifying that was so disappointing to me is, as a presidential historian, I am like a complaint box for the presidency. I I study the dead ones, but everyone thinks I'm responsible for the living ones.
Right.
And I hear about this so much, and I'm always like, yes, I see what you're doing, but there's a method that we're supposed to use to control the madness. That honor falls to Congress. And they have completely failed. And a lot of it is that they are self-serving. Absolutely. So one of the
Correct.
points I made was that what irony that they're going on and on about transparency. They're going on and on about how like this president's the most transparent, cover-ups, this and that. Congress has the right that they retain for themselves, and they continue to do this. When they created the Presidential Records Act, they made this like little caveat where they said, okay, they have to preserve their records. They have to hand them over, as we know, to the Library of Congress, to the Archives Universal, all of this, but not ours. Because sure,
Right.
we are public servants. We are paid by the people who elected us and very much did not. But we are going to retain the right to say these papers are personal, and they're not personal. And so the thing is, there's no transparency. There's no it's a mess, and they're not doing what they need to do. So we haven't had the amendments, we haven't had the self-regulation, we haven't had the regulation of the branches, and we are at, it is, it's a stress test, and I'm not sure we're going to pass it. Doesn't mean
So
we're gonna fall apart, but it just means, like, the America we have always known that we've been comfortable in, even in times of hardship, I don't think that it will be around if this continues.
so let me ask you this. So let's go back to, and I know that as you said, you're responsible because you're a presidential historian. You're responsible for all the presidents, whether you
Sure.
studied them in particular or not.
Mhm.
But let's go back to say the late 1960s.
Yeah.
We've got Vietnam, which is tearing the country apart. We have the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where the Chicago police are just rampaging around Grant Park and other places. And it really looked as if the country was coming up. We have riots, cities are on fire. Kent State, right? 4 students shot by National Guard troops. I can't imagine what would happen now, right? I mean, I can't imagine why there wasn't the uproar then. I mean, obviously there was, but that's the thing is like we survived that, right? And we survived that even through Nixon and Watergate, and Ford, and then we had this sort of aberration of Jimmy Carter. But then he was immediately seen as, we had stagflation in Iran, and he's weak. And then we get Reagan, but it seems to me that the legitimacy of the presidency and the government writ large, Alexis, really didn't really hasn't ever really recovered except in a few spikes here and there, right? You think
Absolutely.
about, I mean, people, Reagan wins 49 states in 84. George H.W. Bush has a 91% approval rating in 91 after the Gulf War, but then goes on to lose his, reelection. Uh, Bill Clinton is in trouble for one thing or another throughout his presidency, but leaves the presidency with 66% approval, right? George W. Bush, for whom I worked, again, has that spike immediately post 9/11, utilizes that for the purposes of going to another war that, spills blood, spills treasure all over the world. And then you get Obama, who's, I think, was legitimately elected, but I think that, sort of rekindled that sort of Jim Crow feeling amongst a lot of people. And then you get Trump, who does people don't see as. And so the reason I'm going through all this, it's so long winded, is that we never got to a place, and I think some of this is also proactive, is that we haven't been in a place where the majority of Americans, at any given moment say the government is good, or at least doing its best. The government is doing what it's supposed to do. And the only reason I bring that up is because the whole idea of governance, if you go back to Hobbes or Locke or any of them, is the idea that like we trade a little bit of individual freedom for collective good. And
Mhm.
now it's like, I want all the individual freedom and I don't care about the collective good. And anybody who tries to tell me that I have to be for the collective good is, a socialist, a communist, a fascist, whatever. And so we're to your point, like we're at this place where we're sort of unmoored from all of the things we've known for almost 250 years.
Absolutely, it's terrifying. The pardon for me is something that is, absolutely out of control. Maybe that's something that's so I wanna take a step back and say that I think justice is central to all of this, and this idea of fairness, right, is that we're talking about equity, and some sort of there will always be the haves and the have-nots and all of this, but, like, what really is disconcerting is and there's a lot of debate. Pew was in the middle of a study when Ford pardoned Nixon, and most of the country said, "Absolutely not." And what happened was with that pardon, and I think we never recovered from this, is that Nixon hadn't even been charged. And the thing about the pardon from the very beginning is that it was meant to be a moment of grace, mercy. That's a really important word here, mercy.
Mhm.
You weren't really being merciful when you pardoned Nixon. You wanted the country to move forward. There's lots of good reasons, but it's not about mercy. And the other thing about the pardon power, which we've never seen a president use it as often and as sort of like loosely as this president, is that it was created at a time where there was no due process, where you did not have a right to an attorney. That's a 20th century jam. That was not around for a long time. That it was unequal in front of the law. Everyone was unequal in front of the law. The first pardon that happened under Washington was for the Whiskey Rebellion.
Mhm.
And that was notable because, of course, we needed money. We had to pay back. We had to pay all these, we had to pay the French. We had to pay the British. You need taxes for government. But the problem was that Washington's government was taxing people who lived in an agrarian state that was not landowning. They leased land, meaning they didn't get to vote because the only people who got to vote in early America were landowning white men.
Right.
So they didn't get to vote. They didn't have a cash flooded society. Like they just didn't have cash. They traded in goods. They bartered. That's how they paid for things. And they were having this rebellion and they did tar and feather a couple of tax people. But the irony, of course, was rife. It's like, okay, no representation, no taxation without representation. You're doing the exact same thing. And
Right.
Washington kind of got he overreacted. Everyone came down on him. But then he pardoned these people. And that seemed fair because what had happened to them was unfair. Now, let's take a step back and let's start from the beginning of this presidency. We have blanket pardons for January 6th, for the insurrectionists. They were tried by a jury of their peers in different states throughout the country, right? Not everyone was tried in DC. And then you have these people who they had representation. They had all these. A lot of people don't think not a lot, unfortunately, but enough don't even think that they should have been pardoned. And then it just goes from there, and you have the pardon power. We've done blanket pardons, but it was for like the Confederacy after the war, so that the country literally could move forward.
Or people who objected to the
Vietnam,
Vietnam War. Right.
yes, but they also had to show up. and they had to, it's not like it was just like, "Okay, now you get to go home and it's fine." They had to show up and register and, like, sort of deal with some of the consequences still. It
Mm,
was just like, "You can show up and you will not be dragged off to jail." And, into prison, and these were important things, and so I do think that that plays a larger role in all of this. There is no real system here that makes sense. And I think what's more alarming is I'm not sure how it will. We will start to, I always say it's so hard to judge a presidency right after. And actually, we're not doing the C-SPAN presidential rankings this year, which is really interesting. I've usually gotten it in the mail and I actually checked in because I thought, oh my God, they haven't arrived yet. Am I off? Am I off the
right.
list or something? No, they're not doing it. And I've always felt like, okay, we need 10 years to judge a presidency. But there are things you do know. So we know an insurrection is bad for America, right? And
Yes.
we also know that the government, everyone talks about the government's inefficient. It's not supposed to run like a for-profit organization. That's a bad thing. But that aside,
Well, just as an aside, as someone who used to do a lot of corporate PR and corporate public affairs, this whole idea of corporate efficiency is bullshit.
right.
Most
And
big
it's like,
companies I know
yeah.
are as inefficient as anything. So
And they
anyway, I'm
spend
sorry.
and waste all the time. So
Right.
we know this, and we know this already, and they're self-serving. We know this from the way that Doge has cut things. But if we think we're not gonna be feeling this from, you name it, taxes, education, the amount of, like, talent that has already left America that's continuing to leave America is astounding. And America functions in a different way. I mean, I'm jumping all over the place right now, but for example, we have all these universities. They blocked different people coming either as students, as graduate students, teaching. All of these people have left. In America, we have all our research go through universities. It's like a sort of pact that was made that doesn't happen in other countries. And now those people are leaving to go to other countries. The things that make America exceptional are kind of all interrelated with these agencies, with these different entities. And when we can't send our children to school because it literally can all these things, it's gonna be a problem. We're gonna feel this immediately. We already do. And so
But
the it's gonna be non-functioning is my point.
but so there's a couple of things. One, it was no less, President Eisenhower, when he left office in 1961, he gave his famous military industrial speech, which you should read. But
Yes.
one part in there, Alexis, too, is he says, and beware universities who start doing things just for the sake of government funding. Right?
Yes.
Like he was
Absolutely.
he was worried about that too. But the other part, and this goes back to what I was writing about yesterday, is like, those things are all true, right? And this is the other part too, is we've too many of us have lost the ability to hold contrary or multiple thoughts in our head simultaneously, which is
Yeah.
all of the things you just said were true. And there are tens of millions of Americans for whom that's not an issue
Yes.
because it does not affect their actual lives, unless of course it was Dana-Farber Cancer Center or whatever it is. But or B, those are worlds in which they have not inhabited, they nor their families will ever inhabit,
Yes.
and they don't like them because they have a pretty good idea, and I think based on my observations of the last few years, is they don't think those people like them either, right?
Right.
And so that's the other part too, is that you use the word equity, and there's no equanimity, right? That's like
Yeah.
we have devalued some, we have overvalued others, and now that is coming home to roost, which is if you sit at your perch in at Harvard, right? You don't the person who works the wage job in Missouri, you probably believe is beneath you, right?
Yeah.
And if you are the wage earner in Missouri and you see people fighting about Harvard, you're like, how does this affect me? And it's one more example of a bunch of people who don't care about my life.
Yes. Absolutely. But then you also have this situation in which, Trump is talking so much about factory jobs, more factory jobs. There are something like 100,000 vacant factory jobs right now in America.
500,000, yes.
I'm sorry,
Per Mike Rowe.
500,000.
Yeah,
Yes.
Mike Rowe, yeah.
I think it was going for New York exclusively, but so people don't want those jobs, and we're deporting a lot of the people who would have, deigned to do those jobs.
But
And
we've also
yeah,
devalued both socially and
absolutely.
economically those jobs.
Absolutely. It's not a living wage. And so some people, It's an absolute mess, so you do have this sort of, "It doesn't affect me, it's not a part of my life," and you have these, like, worlds that you're isolating here, but then you also have this repetition, and that, of course, is where the Conservative Party always wins, is they're going to come down with, like, 5 different things they're all going to say, and they're just gonna keep repeating it, and it works. It works every single time. And then you have the Democrats who are just still scrambling. And so I think it's a mess because people cannot hold these thoughts at once. There is no duality, as you pointed out. And that is one of the things that I think was so interesting about the hearing and about, in general, any conversation I have these days is I thought we were getting closer. There was this moment after Washington came out, and I know hope springs eternal in the heart of a historian. But there was this moment in which we were, the I was at home, the book tour had been canceled, and but people were still reading, and people were reading, in fact, even more. And you had these families who were really politically divided. And I would hear about co-reading, meaning that families who couldn't really talk about anything else would read the book and come together. Or, I would always get people who are like, "How dare you say, put slavery in every chapter?" And I was like, that was literally his main source of income. So yes, because I'm writing about someone's life, so it doesn't belong in a chapter because it's always on his mind. And also, it would be I would not be a very honest historian because what I'm looking at in the archives, it is front and central. So you have these people who are like, they're going to cancel him, and you're going to be a part of that problem. And I'm like, best of luck. Like, how do you do that? How do you cancel George Washington without, please walk me through this process. And so you have them, and they were like, okay, fine. Yes. I just think it's too much. And then the conversation can be, why do it's not that it's too much, it's that you feel like somehow you are being told you're wrong. So
Right.
what are you saying and doing in your own life that makes you feel a little vulnerable here? You don't have, and that's something that we all have to sort of like deal with on our own because bigotry has always been in our homes and in our office. Like this has always been in the Oval Office from the very
And throughout human history, like none of that stuff.
yes. And that is something that somehow it's like, no, I'm not a bigot. I just don't want anyone of color to be equal to me. It's like, well, I think that maybe there's like something going on there. And we all sort of struggle. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have all these people who say, I don't want to know about George Washington because he enslaved people and he was this and he was that and he didn't care about anyone but white men, rich white men. So like I don't want so wouldn't you want to know what you're arguing against? If this is the progenitor of everything you think is wrong with the world, wouldn't you want to go in completely informed so you could absolutely destroy people with your arguments? And then it worked. There was this 2, 3 years in which people were really having these conversations, and then it all just fell to the wayside.
Right.
And then you have things like, the authenticity I think is also something that, we're not gonna really have time to go into, and we've talked about it before, but it is this idea of, politicians and even people, your neighbors, everyone sort of like really just being honest about what's going on and not necessarily caring about the optics, but also not caring about how things sound. Everything is so performative these days in a way
Right.
it really wasn't before, and I think that's the plague of our time.
But if it would, but on the performative piece, if it was performative, there was a point to it, right?
Yeah.
You were using grandiloquent ideas or ideals or words in a certain way to make a broader point that you were trying to get across, right? It was a means to an end as opposed to just the end in itself, which is I'm going to go out because if I look, just as an aside, right? For some reason, right, on my TikTok account at Reed Galen, if
Yes.
you're on TikTok, when I post about Ukraine, when I
Yes.
say something positive about Ukraine, the algorithm takes off. I don't know why, right?
Yeah.
I don't know why, but it does, right? So I was like, well, maybe I should post more about Ukraine, right? But
Yeah.
like, that's what the algorithm wants, right? So
It
it's like,
is what it was.
I care about the Ukrainian people. I believe that we should support them. I believe that they are under attack by, a menacing and bloodthirsty force. But I also utilize them, frankly, metaphorically, because back to your point about both sides in this fight, there's no fight at this point, right? Like
Mhm.
if the
Yeah.
Ukrainians had been Democrats and they saw the Russians coming over the frontier, they would have been like, please go home. Please
Right.
go home. Please go. Wait, wait. Where are you going? Come back. Right? Like that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Like, is if you really care about this stuff, demonstrate it through action, right? Even words. Start with words. I'll take words, but demonstrate through
Yeah.
action. And I'm not talking about action of like sitting on the Capitol steps and having weirdos come sing to you, right? Like that's not what I'm talking about. That's not action. That's again performance for its own sake. And again, I think that we have to take a step back to your point, Alexis, and this is the hard thing that I am struggling with as we look into the future. It could look, this man is going to be president for the next 3.5 years, all things considered. We don't know what will come next. We should expect that MAGA is not going to disappear because the poison is seeped into the states. And not only that, like come 2030, we're going to have about 12 electoral votes and congressional seats go from big blue states to southern red states, right? So that's the
Mhm.
other part. But like if we are not able to coherently and cogently and inspirationally make an argument for not only what we were supposed to be, but what we should be and what we can be. And I'm not talking about we need to build more houses or like why haven't we had high-speed rail in California? Like that's technocratic gobbledygook, right? Like, why does anybody get off their couch to vote? Why does anybody
Yeah.
leave their neighborhood to go volunteer somewhere? Because the
Yeah.
idea is we're better together than we are on our own. But like that in and of itself is like almost a revolutionary thought now.
Yes, absolutely. There's no civic impulses in the way that we really need. There's so much to be done. And one of my favorite parts about going to a place like Iowa to give a talk is everyone is like, "You've never caucused before?" My goodness. Are you even a citizen? And
Right.
I think but they really enjoy it. And there's this idea that, like, government in 3 branches, it's a crisis also of storytelling, right? This generation just does not have good storytellers, and that's a few generations, actually. But there's no, fun to be had and no sort of the power that people seem to really want over other people um, is not just it can be garnered through other way. Like, I really would love to see a real civic struggle, but there's no joy or pride in it, and I think that is something that's, like, a real crisis, and a few fellows at New America have been working on this, and I think they're doing good work, and they're working with museums and such, but this is not my world. I don't
Right.
know how you get that, but I find it like, now I do wanna caucus. They made it sound so fun. I 100% want to.
Well, look, I mean, I worked on the 2000 caucus on George W. Bush's campaign, and this is why people would say, okay, Iowa's not representative of the country. It's okay, like I'm not talking demographically, but if you are someone who is willing to go to a church or a high school gymnasium or whatever the other caucus site is on a night in January, and let me just tell you, as someone the caucus night, let me tell you how cold it was. It was so cold, Alexis, that the heel of my shoe froze to the tarmac at the Des Moines airport.
Yeah,
That's how cold it was,
I believe
right?
that.
Which
Yeah.
meant like, and I was like a volunteer on a campaign. These people intentionally left their homes to participate.
Yeah.
Right, like, that's civic engagement. There's another part too, just and I don't wanna get I love my Hawkeyes and I love, the Cyclones, and I love I mean, I've been to all parts of the state. But the other part too is, like, they take it seriously,
I
right? Like,
do.
as the New Hampshireites do too, that's it's closer to your part of
Yeah.
the world, like, if you can't answer the question of the guy in Indianola, should you run the free world, right?
Mm.
If you can't put up with a flinty New Hampshireite, do you think you can deal with Vladimir Putin? And that's why, like, the running for the presidency is like sort of the greatest political gauntlet humanity's ever come up with because you have to be able to do it all. And very
Right.
few people can.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the emphasis is on very few people can and very few people should.
Right. And because it's mid 2025, if you want to be the presidential nominee in 2028, maybe you should do something else other than tell people that's what you want to do right now because it is way too early for any of this stuff. You guys are not focused on the fight in front of you. You're focused on your own ambition. And my fear is that, unfortunately, Alexis, their ambition far outweighs anything other than why they actually want to run for office, other than they think they'd be better than A, their opponents, or B, Donald Trump or JD Vance or whoever. All right. I have
Yes.
taken too much of your time, Alexis. Before I let you go, where can folks find you here on Substack? Where can they find you online? And where can they find your books?
My Substack is called Study, Marry, Kill. My books are available in most bookstores, Amazon, bookshop.org, all the places, and libraries too. And I'm around Blue Sky, not that often on Twitter. Instagram is a good place to go. And I love to hear from people, most people, and engage. And I think I do think of this as I am a public servant of sorts. And so I'm always happy to really contextualize or answer questions directly. But of course, I have too many opinions and ideas of my own.
No such thing. There's no such thing. As always, gang, I hope you sign up for Study, Marry, Kill. I hope you also subscribe to the Homefront. You guys can find me on TikTok and Twitter and says.us at Reed Galen, on Threads and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA. But guys, stay in the conversation. The conversation will lead to meeting. The meeting will lead to community. The community will lead to the fight we need. Alexis Coe, thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks, Reed. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Everybody else, have a great Tuesday. Bye bye.
Bye.